joining us. Lindsay Burke is the Will Skillman Fellow in Educational Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. Juan Williams is somebody who needs no introduction other than to say that we're incredibly grateful here at Heritage for the many ways that he's engaged with us over the last couple of years on this important issue. So thank you both, and maybe Juan, if I can start off with you, can you just talk about why this has been such an important issue for you personally over the years?
This is the D.C. Opportunity Act, and I think it's simple to say I live in D.C. And living here, I have paid for my 3 children to go through schools because the public schools were such a disaster. And as a parent, I did not feel comfortable in sending my children to those schools. So that's a pretty simple and direct answer to the question. But I would also put in there this, that I was interviewing, actually in my role as a journalist, Senator Scott last week, and one of the things he said to me was the whole notion of wanting to create change in a system that's failing children, that if he is that child that wants a good opportunity, wants an education, he would want someone, some politician, somebody to stand up and say, this is an urgent need right now. That's what Senator Scott said to me. And without being playful about the fact that you can attest that you said it, I think that's exactly what we have at stake right now, is a need to blow up a dysfunctional system. And that's why I would back the use of any system, but in specific the one at hand, charter schools, vouchers, under the umbrella of school choice. We were talking about other mechanisms, tax credits and the like. But anything that would, much in the way that you think of Star Wars and May the Force be with you, get in there and say, you know, we have an urgent problem for every child in the public school structure to blow up a failing system and give that chance right now an opportunity to succeed.
So Lindsay, many of us here in D.C. know about the D.C. Opportunity Scholarship Program. We know the success stories. What are some of the success stories from around the country that we should also know about?
Yeah, and we talk a lot about DC. It's right here in our backyard, which makes it such a shame that the president has singled out the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program every year to try to zero out funding for this highly successful option. It is right in his backyard. And that was a great overview of Senator Scott of all of the successes that it's produced. And we've worked here with families over the years. There's a wonderful graduate of the DCOSP, Jordan, and she is the first student who went through the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, went on to graduate college, and is now living in Japan teaching English. So we have all of these wonderful stories that have come out of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. But we're seeing that, Mike, you're exactly right, replicated across the country. It's not just DC. We're seeing it in places like Arizona. Arizona has engaged in what we're calling School Choice 2.0, where they're moving beyond the very worthwhile goal of providing vouchers to really giving parents control of every single penny that is their child's educational allocation. And so in Arizona, a parent can receive 90% of what the state would have spent on the child in the public system. It goes right on to a restricted use debit card. Parents can pay for private school tuition, online learning, special education services, educational therapies, curricula, textbooks, so they can really direct every single dollar of their child's education funding. And that has empowered parents in a newfound way. They can roll over unused dollars from year to year. So you have parents thinking about opportunity cost. Are they getting a good value for the money that's spent? They can even roll it into a college savings account. So this is just massive innovation in terms of school choice policy. So we have examples like that in Arizona. In places like Louisiana, they've gone beyond just school choice to course choice. Parents are choosing among courses and among teachers, not just among schools. So the states are really showing what they're able to do in terms of school choice policy. And I think it's a really exciting time to be thinking about ed policy and the future of it.
And so, Lindsay, just to follow up, keeping decision-making as close to the family is something that's important. We call it federalism here at the Heritage Foundation. Federal education financing is only 10% of the total financing. Can you talk about Senator Scott's legislation and why it is such an important role for federal lawmakers?
Yeah, that's a great point that you make, Mike. Federal education financing really is just 10% of all ed financing. So the federal government, you can think about them as sort of being a 10% stakeholder in terms of what we spend, that $600 billion that you mentioned we spend a year. 10% of that is taxpayer money that's spent through federal programs. So the remaining 90% is spent at the state and local level. So it's not just a matter of federalism, which is important and should guide policymaking, but it's a matter of just practically speaking where the dollars are. So when we see school choice programs move forward, and when we see state and local policymakers work to craft them, it's important to keep that in mind. So where the dollars are, you want parents to have control over that funding. So you're absolutely right. All of the money's sort of at the state and local level, and that's why we want to see those crafted at the state and local level.
Let's go to the audience for questions. Yes, sir.
I'd like Juan to comment on the most powerful opposition to this is how do you confront that special power or that special interest group?
You know, this is an interesting point, and again, I come back to, I was interviewing Senator Scott for a piece that I wrote for The Hill. It came out today, and we were talking in general terms about how you impress upon people the importance of school choice so that you can get public support for this, and in specific, in minority communities. And the treacherous thinking behind this journalist talking to this public official was, in fact, that the unions really have a stranglehold in terms of minority parents. And I have long thought, why is it that poor minority parents aren't out in the streets marching and screaming bloody murder given what happens to their children in public schools? Well, the reality is, I think that the unions have convinced them that this is a source of jobs and patronage and contracts, and the focus on the child and the education of the child has been lost. And so instead of focusing on the failure to educate the child and give the child the opportunity to move beyond, the focus is on, oh, this is a source of jobs and opportunity for the adults in this community. And that's where the unions come in. And that's why I think the unions have this stranglehold as I described it to you. Now, Senator Scott sitting here, I don't know why I'm talking for him, but Senator Scott said to me—
You're doing a fine job so far.
All right, so far.
So far.
You know that's limited.
That's what I was thinking.
But Senator Scott's position is if you can get the message out, and he cited some of these numbers in his speech. Here is what you can get for your dollar, and here's why you should be controlling that dollar as a parent as opposed to the bureaucracy and the government, that then you would start to shift opinions, that parents would see very clearly that it was in their self-interest to try something else. Door number 2, I believe.
Yes, sir.
There we go. I was paying attention
That's
to
an
it.
accurate quote, as a matter of fact.
That's a rare thing for us.
That's right.
That's very rare.
We don't do this very often, but I would like to piggyback on what you just said, because too often we have an education system that seems to be designed for adults and not for kids. And so we should ask ourselves the question: those adults who care most about the kid are called parents. And teachers love kids as well. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, when I look at the success of some schools back at home, Meeting Street Academy has 2 locations, one in the Low Country, one in the Upstate, and the parents are immersed in the education responsibilities of their kids. And it's producing amazing results. And when I've traveled the country, whether it's Cleveland or in Wisconsin, looking at either choice programs or charter school programs, what I find is that the part of that secret sauce of success, it's not figuring out how to go from 600 billion to 700 billion. It's how to get parents intimately involved on a daily basis or a weekly basis in education decisions for their kids, and how to make sure that they partner with the teachers. And any system that doesn't start with the kid and work their way out is a system that's bound to fail at the objective of producing a product that is competitive in a global society, in a global world, where the economics factors are driving companies to other places. And if we had a conversation specifically about STEM and the impact that STEM education is going to have on America's competitive position globally, it's a very interesting and provocative conversation that we could have.
And if I could just add, too, from the teacher's perspective, this is pretty liberating, right? The fact that you are now empowering families and not just funding school systems, the fact that that is an existential threat to the union power. And I think this is part of the reason why you see in states that shift from being a forced unionism state to a right-to-work state, a precipitous decline in union membership when teachers are actually given the choice. So this is sort of choice from both ends of the spectrum, choice for teachers, choice for students. And I should just add, too, Senator Scott's proposal is important because it takes that 10%, that 90-10 share we were talking about a minute ago, and it allows that 10% to be portable. If a state wants to take the money that is designated for children with special needs and allow parents to take that to a private school of choice, they're able to do that. So the money that we're spending at the federal level, that 10% share, it becomes much more flexible and student-centered.
Andy?
One of the biggest arguments against. Thank you. One of the biggest arguments against school choice is the lack of funding that go in the public schools, and that funding dries up, and that's to the detriment of all the kids who stay in the public schools. But yet, Lindsay, you've said about the programs in Arizona and Louisiana. Where do they find this lack of funding from?
Yeah, so a few things on that. We have a growing body of empirical evidence that shows not only does school choice benefit the students who receive a voucher or a scholarship to attend a private school that their parents have chosen, but the public system improves as well. We often talk about school choice being a rising tide that lifts all boats. That competitive pressure that personally I think has been lacking from the public system for decades now, that competitive pressure when parents actually have a right of exit out of a school that's not meeting the needs of their child has really produced some beautiful results for the students who decide to remain in the public system as well. If you look at Florida, they have a large scholarship program for children with special needs. Not only did the children who received a scholarship see statistically significantly improved results in terms of academic achievement, but so did their peers who chose to stay in the public system. And so I think as we're thinking through school choice, our default position should be that everyone makes a choice when they enter the system. And if that happens to be your local public school, that's great if it's meeting your needs. But public schools should not have the virtue of receiving dollars and students, no matter how poorly they're performing. And so I think that competitive aspect is something that we'll see replicated, and we will see improvements across the board.
And I think the key here, just tying in something that we've heard from Lindsay and Senator Scott, is that you are, from my perspective, empowering parents. You are believing in the idea that the parent loves, cares for that child, and believes in that child's potential, however limited that potential might be, but believes the child has potential, and that the parent is going to make the wise choice for their child. And I think that's the key here, empowering parents.
Yeah, and sorry, I'll add one other thing on that too. School choice program design, if you look at Arizona, which I mentioned a little while ago, with their Ed Savings Account program, parents get 90% of that money. 10% remains with the school system. So for things like fixed overhead costs that the public school's currently dealing with, Arizona's taken that into consideration. So as states are crafting school choice programs, they're thinking about things like overhead costs that you'll often hear opponents bring up. So.
The other thing I'd add to that, too, is if you think about the number of schools that are closing in school districts across the country, and if we're talking about a per pupil count, per school count, let's look at D.C. specifically, if 15 schools closed, that's going to put amazing pressure for those kids from those 15 schools to go to other schools, right? So the real question is, if you do the math and figure it out, the number of schools that are closing, the number of students that are being transferred, the number of costs that are being transferred, why wouldn't you have a component in there where part of the transferability or transfer opportunity really goes to a school choice opportunity or component, as opposed to simply saying the school that still, or the students that are left behind, what's there for them? Well, actually, a lot of the schools are closing. And if that's happening, not everywhere, but it's happening somewhere, perhaps there's an opportunity for us to have a discussion about those resources in a pool. And if we're thinking about, Senator Alexander and myself co-sponsored a bill that he wrote where you take $22 billion out of a $600 billion fund, we're talking 4%, 3.5%. Can we have an experiment? Well, y'all please let us have an experiment with 4% of the money to see if we can be competitive with Finland and 4 Asian countries that are top 1 through 5. That's really what I'm asking. in some of the places where we're seeing the least performance or the lowest performance.
Ms. in the black.
I wonder, to what extent are you considering innovations such as the Khan Academy and their 3,000 course modules, which are being used in the Oakland system now and East Palo Alto, I think, amongst other places, to very good effect, and especially with low-achieving individuals who just were bored to death, and now they can proceed at their own speed, and they even become tutors. And this is a book by Salman Khan called One World Schoolhouse. The other comment I wanted to make is, what about drug-free schools and schools free of drug paraphernalia? I don't know if you're familiar with the fact that vaporizers are now being used on the way to school in buses with marijuana in them, and kids are getting high and are coming to school high. And can something like that, considerations for these kinds of things, be included in what you're doing?
Yes, ma'am. I noticed you were looking at Juan for the second question, so I'll leave that for him. And the first question, as you were looking at me, I'll tell you that I took the time last night. It's interesting that you'd asked that question last night. I was on the khanacademy.org website, taking a look at it, because I can't figure out this DC math. I'm not sure why it is that I'm confused. We're spending more money than we're taking in. It just doesn't seem logical to me. So I went and took a look at their macro and microeconomics courses, and it'll walk you through what seems to be Adam Smith's perspective on the economy, but I'm not quite sure why I got lost. But think about what we're looking at 10 years from now, and when we look back in year 20, perhaps 24, at education as we know it today. Newt Gingrich has a book called Breakout that talks about this education model. The fact of the matter is you can go online and get a pretty strong education almost for free. So we're spending $600+ billion trying to provide a world-class education, and it's at best mediocre too often. And we're having places online where you can get a pretty competitive education if you have the time to invest when you get off from work. So I think the next iteration of education and the competition to come is how the internet and virtual schools will start replacing and or competing with this notion that we have today of education. So on the second part of that question on using vaporizers or something for something, I'm going to let you deal with that something.
Well, given where you work, I thought you might be an expert in this area.
Well, I left the House of Representatives and I am now in the Senate, so
that's
I'm
true.
not quite sure
You're
what you're
quite
talking about.
distinguished now.
I don't know anything about that drug paraphernalia. It's really my point. It's not that I'm more distinguished. It was a lateral move the last time I checked. But anyways.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought up Khan Academy. I just think it's an amazing sort of innovation, and I do think it will herald in a revolution in ed reform, and not just Khan Academy, but there's so many online options now, whether it's K-12 or at the higher ed level. At the higher ed level, and I think we'll probably hear more about this afternoon, you have Harvard and MIT that are coming together to form edX, which provide free online courses. These are some of the most august institutions in the world that are providing these options for free. You do have some high-quality options that parents have to pay for at the K-12 level as well, but this is where I think financing mechanisms like ed savings accounts become so important, or an option in Louisiana to go from not only school to school, but course to course. So when we talk about these options, these are in essence just the financing mechanism that allow parents to access all of these options. And while Khan Academy is free, it does allow them to access other online learning options. One line that I love that Sal Khan says in One World Schoolhouse, the book that you mentioned, he said, right now, learning is variable and time is fixed. We need to flip that equation so learning is fixed and time is variable. And I think that's what online learning and school choice writ large really help us to do. It's this mass customization of learning that is student-centric and basically ensures that a student masters a concept before they move on, so that learning piece is fixed, not variable for students. And one other thing on that too, I think on the homeschooling front, imagine what this could do for homeschooling. A parent now being equipped with Khan Academy, those 3,000 lessons in economics or math or DC math, whatever it might be, that are now
Fuzzy math.
equipped, fuzzy math, right? These parents that are now equipped with a world of knowledge, maybe being even more confident to say, you know what, maybe I will take on the challenge of homeschooling. So there are all of these, I think, benefits that could come from this online learning revolution that's at our doorsteps.
Senator, can you talk specifically on the Choice Act, where it stands legislatively and what we can all do to help it move forward?
Well, where it stands legislatively, we put it in, I think, January 9th, we submitted the bill. I'm not sure if you're aware of the way the Senate has been progressing this year. I think there were 180 bills passed by the House that have not seen the light of day. I've heard of the Do Nothing Congress, but it sounds like the Do Nothing Senate. There's a person that you could call, I think it's Senator Harry Reid, would go a long way to helping us have a serious debate on whether or not the bill itself, the Choice Act, has merits. I'd love to have that debate on the floor of the Senate. I think we could have a robust debate with parents and teachers throughout the country if we could find a way to get it to a vote. But right now, it seems to be right behind the other couple hundred bills that we haven't taken up so far.
Is there any bipartisan interest that you find amongst your colleagues, even if it's not spoken about in public?
There is. I had a great conversation last week with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson about the legislation is heading to her office late last week, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have that discussion and perhaps get some co-sponsor that will help it to move through the Senate as well. But one of the things that's starting to happen, I see in the education front, is that we're starting to look at the outcome. It's an interesting conversation to have when you're focused on the outcome and not the intentions. As too often we may demonize people's intentions and not have a serious conversation about the outcomes. And the more we focus on the outcomes of education, the more I'm realizing that there are some folks, they say politics makes strange bedfellows. There are folks coming together, Ted Cruz and Sheila Jackson coming together, looking at ways to improve the outcome because it's so important to who we are as a people. And this nation will benefit from that debate.
Yes, ma'am, on the right.
Is getting parents more involved in their children's lives and doing it through their education. But if they're involved in that, they're going to start to get more involved in other areas. And it's going to, talking about outcomes, the outcome of children graduating, getting jobs, taking care of themselves, not being on welfare, of not being involved in drugs and alcohol and all the other things out there, and just improving their lives in all these areas. I think you're going to see a lot of side outcomes come out of that.
You're 100% correct. I will tell you that when I was flunking out of high school as a freshman, I flunked out and was on my way to becoming just a normal stat in the area where I lived. And my mother, she got pretty serious about my educational outcomes, and she loved me a lot. She also believed that love comes at the end of a switch, which is a Southern apparatus of encouragement, and she got seriously involved in my education, and my outcomes started to change as well. But we need parents to catch the kids when they're tilting or getting ready to fall over, and I was fortunate. I think there are parents everywhere in this country asking for a lifeline. Help me help myself. And this does that. And I take that pretty seriously, though we want to have fun while we're talking about it because too many people are asleep in this part of the conversation.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, not that anyone would condone folks breaking the law, but you often see news stories about parents who risk breaking the law to find a school that's outside of their child's assigned zip code. So the extent to which a parent will go to find a quality education for their child, I think, is evidence in some of those stories that we see. And one of the great lines that came out from the evaluation of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program conducted by the University of Arkansas and the Department of Ed was that school choice in the DC voucher program moved parents from the margins to the centers of their child's academic experience. And we see that over and over again in school choice programs throughout the country. The level to which parental involvement is increased as a result of choice.
Yes, sir.
A broader question in education. Senator Scott, but Von Williams can also participate. You alluded to one person controls what gets on the Senate floor. Why does Senate rules allow that, or what can be done about that?
Well, sir, the more we have tried to force a conversation, the worse the rules have gotten this year, or last year as well. So we've seen the nuclear option, we've seen the implosion of the Senate as we've known it for the last couple hundred years, progressively getting worse. And as far as what we can do about that, sir, the evidence is coming in pretty clearly. There are probably 6 things specifically we can do about it. One's called North Carolina, Louisiana, West Virginia, South Dakota. They're called elections. We need 6 more Republicans so that we can change the leadership of the Senate, which is the shortest answer I'll actually have today.
We'll leave it at that.
I'm totally on board with what you're saying. What about negative consequences? You know, unintended consequences. I'm thinking of, say, people like in Arizona that would take $9,000 and they figure out a way to waste it, or, you know, unintended consequences. This is a good thing for parents in general. What about parents who don't care about their kids? There's a few of those around. You know, how does this affect them?
Well, let me take a shot at that one. I'll give Senator Scott some time to think.
Amen.
No, this is a real part of this conversation. In fact, Lindsay and I were talking before we came out about the Justice Department suit in Louisiana that's against school choice. And their argument is, of course, that this is a lure to resegregation of schools, that what you're really doing is allowing the white children to get out of these schools and form some kind of Southern segregationist academy. Now, this is a ludicrous suggestion in this context. The minute you look at it, you will discover that the scholarships are limited to low-income children, principally in New Orleans, principally black kids, and overwhelmingly districts that are already under the Desegregation Act. Am I right so far?
Yep. that's
There we
right.
go. Okay, so the expert agrees. So but that is, again, a danger, as you were talking about. I would say another danger is that you have, in some cases, in terms of school choice, particularly in terms of charters, people form charters that are really for some, extremist religious group. They have a high rate of closures in some areas. Why aren't high standards being maintained in that charter school environment? And how do you enforce standards in a charter school or even a voucher environment? What is the relationship between government funding, which is the money in the voucher, and wherever that money goes? That's another potential hazard. And do these schools take all children? One of the big complaints that comes from the public school supporters is, oh, the charter schools don't have to take kids with bad records or disabled kids or kids that have behavioral problems. We take them all. And that's why you get better results out of the charters, vouchers, et cetera. So these are all the negative consequences. And as you said in your question, there are some parents who may not be the kind that would line up, early in the morning or days before in order to try to get their child into the best possible charter school. They don't care about the kid, they're lost. And so are we, in fact, condemning the child, even as we're trying to help the child, because the parent, is not involved, and it's not going to be involved no matter what we do. I think these are all cheap excuses, and here's why. I think that if you right now look at the status quo, you will see an inordinate, to my mind, disgraceful number of children who are being failed by the current system. And when you talk about breaking apart this system and giving power to parents, there are people who will point out potential negatives, potential failures, et cetera. But at this point, to me, the big problem is the status quo. Children who are being ill-served, and we have evidence in terms of the statistics that were cited earlier by Senator Scott on graduation rates, dropout rates, specifically, again, in the minority community, but, you know, don't walk away from here thinking this is a conversation about those Black and Hispanic kids. You should check out what's going on with the white kids as well. And even in the supposedly wonderful suburban schools, go compare them to the schools in the other developed Western nations in terms of how they compare on STEM outcomes. And you would say, oh my gosh, what's going on with American education at this start of this 21st century? So to me, what you're looking at is people who will cite, you know, potential stumbles, potential problems along the way. But to my mind, the urgent task for us in this moment is to acknowledge the failure of the current system and blow it up.
There is undeniable risk, without any question, to anything that we do. Perhaps the greatest risk, however, is to maintain the status quo. And I was trying to do the math in my head, but I didn't get it finished yet. But if you think, it's like 50 to 70,000 students in the school system. I'm not sure how many kids there are in D.C. 71,000? Do you know? So there's 55,000 in Charleston County. We have about 4 million folks in my state, 46 counties. So my county is one of the larger ones, 50,000 students. Think about the opportunity cost for 50,000 students at the average D.C. price tag of $20,000 per student versus 50,000 students if we had them all enrolled in opportunity scholarships at $8,500. Think about the cost of the graduation difference between 56% at $20,000, $8,500 getting 97%. Think about the difference in those who go on to get a 2-year degree or 4-year degree and what that means to everything from our manufacturing hub that with the great natural gas prices, we see manufacturers coming back to our country versus what we would see if we didn't have this product going through the 2-year schools. Think about the fact that the unemployment rate is 3% for those with a 4-year degree, 10% for those who don't graduate from high school, which is up 44%. So we're going to pay an astronomically high number to produce higher unemployment, higher government dependency, or we can pay 40% on the dollar, reduce our unemployment rate, reduce our government dependence, as well as improve the likelihood of more businesses, more opportunities in a global economy where the competition is serious about taking us out.
And if I could just add too, since you mentioned Arizona, they have put good fiscal accountability measures in place there. So parents have to submit receipts about that show their educational expenditures every quarter to the Department of Revenue. They don't get the next quarter's disbursement until they've submitted those receipts. So they have some good fiscal accountability measures in place. And yes, you're always going to get a couple of bad apples, but I don't think that should be our default position when we think about parents. By and large, they are fighting with every breath to get the best possible educational opportunity for their children. And I think in Arizona, part of that, you'll see evidence of that just by going online and looking at the Yahoo group. All of the parents that are in Arizona's Ed Savings Account program got together organically, got on this Yahoo group. They're going back and forth talking about what educational options work for their kids, and their child has this special need and what's worked well for them, and best practices on utilizing their Ed Savings Account. So I'm much more optimistic that that's the type of outcome we'll see than any sort of fraud that might be in the program.
Jerry.
Question about the current structure of the public school system. I saw a statistic recently that was startling. It said something like in the last 30 years, the number of teachers in the public system has increased at a compounded rate of 1 or 2%, and the number of administrators had compounded at 7%. That's annual compounding. So in other words, the administrative and overhead staff has grown dramatically. The number of teachers has not. So I would, perhaps your newer methods, your options, your choice, your charter schools could help get at this model problem. And the second thing I'd say is don't we need a system where we attract the best teachers, the best people, and reward those teachers and celebrate those teachers? Because in my own experience, I remember the great teachers I had in school and recognize how much they helped me over my life. So I think the current system often does not differentiate excellence in teachers from ordinary or less than that. Thank you.
There are, when I was in the South Carolina State Legislature in the State House, we had some measures to improve the actual in-classroom expenditures versus the overhead. And so in my state at the time, this is back in 2008 or 2009, I think the numbers are 44 cents on the dollar went to the classroom 56 cents on the dollar did not. The national average was around 65 cents on the dollar went to the classrooms. And so the debate that we had, and our governor was in the State House with me then, and she had a piece of legislation, if I have this correct, that was to take our state average from 44 cents to 65 cents. And all of that, what that means is $1.6 billion more, I think it was at the time, into the classrooms. And so the debate that we have about money really should be a debate about how we use the money. The average education department employee, I believe, makes around $100,000, $103,000 a year, whereas a teacher makes a whole lot less than that typically. And so what we ought to have a debate about is where are our priorities, starting with the kid and who's closest to the kid, and make sure that we pay and reward those folks that are closest to the kid, and take a look at how we're using those dollars. But the evidence is pretty clear, and I certainly believe in a ground zero up approach to that, and having the folks closest to the student helping making those decisions, and not me in Washington, but that is a part of that serious debate that we ought to have.
And the federal government has layered such a bureaucratic compliance burden onto states and local school districts that you can hardly blame them, really, for all of the administrative bloat that they've had to take on over the years just to comply with the Department of Education's paperwork demands. And we have seen tremendous administrative bloat. Just a couple of stats we've seen since the 1960s, a 7% increase in the number of students that are enrolled in public schools across the country, but an 84% increase in the number of teachers and administrative staff. And if you just look at the teacher to non-teacher ratio, in 1960, there were 2.36 teachers for every non-teacher in a classroom. Today, it's 1-to-1. So for every school teacher you see in a district, there's an administrative counterpart. And so much of that is just that bureaucratic compliance burden that's levied on school districts from Washington.
Senator, thank you for your leadership on this. Juan Williams, thank you for being with us. And Lindsay, thanks for putting it all together and giving us these great ideas that we can turn into legislative text. So,
Thank you, Mike.
thank you all.